Preface. Piles of paper have been written about Egyptian forts and fortifications dated to the New Kingdom or Roman period, but only a fraction of them refer to the Saite military complexes. In the recent decades, these strongholds became a phenomenon which has been quite extensively studied and meticulously analyzed. This may be due to the fact that the new structures, or rather their remains, have recently emerged from the swampy delta, Tel Kedwa and Tel Al Balamun, a fortress and a secure citadel, both situated in strategically important locations, but also considerably different in size and layout. Some scholars have therefore the tendency to consider only the former as a military building, while they would prefer the latter and all similar buildings, Necrotis, Daphne, to be reclassified as temples or palaces, which they were not. For this reason, a part of this book provides a short description of the various Saite military structures, which probably make for a rather monotonous reading of facts that are already known, but which is necessary in order to form a base for the discussion that follow. Taking into account the current state of research, I am sure that not every reader of this book will agree with my conclusions, which reflect a rather complicated situation regarding the Egyptian boundaries in the border context of Near Eastern movements, a situation to which the Egyptians responded both with the creation of a respectful mercenary army and the massive building of fortifications. I would like to express my sincere thanks to my Czech colleagues from the Abu Sir Shaft Tombs team who gave up their free Fridays and patiently undertook with me numerous trips to the sites in the Eastern Delta which were crucial to the site defense system, and also to my British colleagues from the Combe Ferin mission, where also one of the Petrie Citadel stands, for the very inspiring discussion of the chain of Western Delta fortifications and architectural design. Last but not least, my thanks goes to the many others who helped me constantly in many ways and without whose generous support this book could not have been written. Katerina Yuskos. Okay, list. Although the first millennium BC seemingly appears to be an era not so long ago, and the politics of Egypt at the time resembled in many aspects that of the states along the eastern Mediterranean, our knowledge of it is still insufficient. One of the reasons that the substantial evidence has almost disappeared despite the fact that the number of foreigners, both individuals and large groups of diverse ethnics for whom Egypt had become a final destination, increased radically around the time. During this era, the history of the country more than any time before was made in the Nile Delta, which was more open to new influences. Libyan chieftains became kings of Egypt and dynasties 22nd to 24th ruled over the north of the country for more than 200 years. This period of political disorder and unrest led to the interior policy becoming a priority. The emergence of Kushites from the heart of Nubia stirred the political scene not only in Egypt, but also beyond its eastern boundary. The Kushites' endless struggle with the local kinglets of the Delta are vividly described in the famous victory stela of the Kushite king Pianki. The punitive expeditions of the Assyrian army dealt Egypt further very drastic lessons in Oriental cruelty. After such a fall into political insignificance, things could only have picked up for Egypt. The Saites, powerful rulers of the Kingdom of the West, and the subsequent architects of unification in Egypt, were mentioned already on the Pianki Stela, more precisely Pianki's contemporary Tefnut. It seems that the political situation was not right at the time. The beginning of Psamtik's rule did provide much hope for a successful and independent future either. In fact, Psamtik I was a man who was able to combine diplomacy with the military acts on the right scale and with the right allies. In this respect, him employing Carian and Ionian mercenaries, good military trained troops from Asia Minor, was the right move towards the elimination of the widespread Egyptian particularisms. With their help, Psamtik created a large regular army with a strong fighting spirit and reunited under the Saite dynasty. The first decade of his rule passed in fights against the kinglets of the Delta, the frequent uprisings of the Libyan tribes coming from the west, and of the Kushites from the south, and certainly resulted in the men belonging to the military ranks gaining higher political and social status. This can be documented by the illegitimate usurpation of the throne by the previously unknown general Amasis, Ahmosis II, during the civil war in 570 BC. One cannot omit the crucial role of Memphis as the administrative and military headquarters of the country, whilst Sais, as a patrimony of the rulers of the Dynasty 26, can be considered the religious center with the impressive temple of the state goddess Niet. The well fortified town lying in the heart of Egypt was frequently used as a base for the military expeditions of the Saite kings. Contingents contingents of mercenaries were garrisoned in several camps within and outside the enclosure walls. These very well paid employees of the ruler welcomed warfare as a source of income. They mostly set out in the eastern direction towards territories that had traditionally been of interest to Egypt, and were they more or less successful, and they were more or less successfully changed the small states of the Levant, and where they more or less successfully changed the small states of the Levant into temporary buffers between Egypt and the more powerful Near Eastern empires, Assyria, Babylonia, and Persia. However, paramount the results were of Psamtik's foreign of However paramount were the results of Psamtik's foreign policy. He was an experienced military tactic and strategist. He as an experienced military tactician and strategist very soon started building an effective defense system around the whole area of the Nile Delta and the southern border. Foundation deposits from Daphne and Tel El Balamun bear substantial evidence of his activities in the Delta. Herodotus then provided supplementary information due to the lack of monuments dated to the site period, and the changes and development in the military architecture cannot be demonstrated sufficiently. There is a massive fortress at Tel Kedwa on one side and several much smaller and not so complex structures at Necrotis. Daphne and Tel Al Balamun, designated as cantonments, forts, citadels, fortified barracks, etc., on the other side. However, all of these constructions share a major common feature: a massive elevated mud brick cellular structure with rather regularly arranged interior compartments, shafts, and corridors, intentionally filled with debris. Although this technique used in late period architecture has been detected even in the prior area of archaeological excavation in Egypt, it has only recently been accurately considered by Oren to be an engineering technique used mostly in the waterlogged soil of the Nile Delta. It definitely means that the end of the end of a number of dubious opinions that these mud brick constructions used to be treasuries, storehouses, etc. This technique was the preferred one for a really wide range of buildings which rested on a elevated platform constructed from mud brick, a cheap and traditional Egyptian material. Apart from the buildings belonging to the military architecture, which is the main topic of this book, also various types of temples, chapels, administrative buildings, and private houses were erected and will be briefly mentioned. The layout of the fortress at Tel Kedwa shares many elements common to older massive Egyptian fortresses known from the lower Nubia: tremendous defense enclosure walls constructed from accessible building material, reinforced by towers at the corners and with bastions and regular intervals along the whole length, and extramural and intramural structures. A clear development can be recognized here despite the fact that the site fortress stood on a flat, swampy ground, and the possibilities of defense with which the engineers could have operated were rather limited. Another site fortress at the Nubian Dorginardi then continued in all traditions of Egyptian military architecture. In light of these facts, the former designation of mud brick buildings at Necrotis, Daphne, and Tel Al Balamun as forts seems to be unsustainable. Perhaps the classification of these constructions by Petrie and other scholars was not appropriate, and the term secure citadels would be more accurate. But there is no doubt about their defense purposes. This is well documented on the last mentioned structure, a citadel, a fortified barracks, according to the excavator A.J. Spencer, at Tel Al Balamun, which stood at the corner of the Saite enclosure wall with the access strategically protected by a small temple. During the excavation, an approach ramp and attached control point, a so-called annex, have also been unearthed. The size and layout of the military complex rested on an elevated mud brick platform and contrasted considerably with other late period temples inside the enclosure. But on the other side, it was almost identical in all its features with the mud brick building uncovered by W.M.F. Petrie at Necrotis. The interpretation of this totally destroyed construction as a Ptolemaic temple can, in light of this, be hardly accepted. The fortified royal palace of the king Apis at Memphis belongs to another type of Saite military architecture. This palace, absolutely unique in its design, featured in its SW corner an impressive tower citadel with massive walls and narrow corridors. There was a large camp of mercenaries situated in close vicinity of the royal palace, and the royal complex was surrounded by a chain of mud brick walls. The building was accessible by a wide, sloping mud brick platform of casemate construction. W.M.F. Petrie considered a complex of several mud brick structures at another famous site, Daphne, to be a palace fort. Although the design of the main building is far from similar to the sumptuous palace of Apis, the large domed interior casemates could have held heavy stone columns and stone pavement, and the adjacent series of rather large buildings might have provided comfortable living conditions for high-ranking commander or high-ranking commanders. The armor discovered on the site provides evidence of intensive defense activities of large garrisons. Then there are various types of temples resting on mud brick platforms, usually perpendicular to the axis of the main temples. They are much smaller in size and entirely different in design. Shenawab, a pure stone house located inside a temple precinct, is certainly worth mentioning. It was found at several sites all over Egypt. C. Traunecker defined these pure storehouses as buildings with an important economic function in the preparation, consecration, and distribution of temple offerings. These activities took place in particular parts of the building. The open forecourt with lateral chapels was used for the preparation of offerings, and the cult activities were carried out in an inner group of magazines with a shrine containing a stone naos. There were other small constructions which could be considered small chapels, bark stations, etc. As mentioned above, not only military buildings and temples, but also storehouses and private houses rested on elevated platforms. Recent and/or ongoing archaeological excavations revealed some such at Qasr Alam and Tel Al Farah in Buto. These are very promising sites which offer new information through meticulous analysis of results and shed more light on not only their own history but hopefully also on the already discovered structures which still escape our accurate classification. Chapter 1. Egypt under the Saite rulers. Through its history, pharaonic Egypt had been occupied for various lengths of time by numerous invaders, but no dynasty before or after has been tormented by conquerors from the Near East as much as the Saite dynasty, 664 to 525 BC. The beginning of the Saite dynasty, the 26th dynasty, was marked by a permanent struggle between the Assyrian kings and the Kushites, representatives of the 25th dynasty expanding to Egypt from the Nubia. following a 140-year-long period of the reign of Saite Dynasty, finally bled to death. The reign of the Saite Dynasty finally bled to death in a well-prepared military campaign of the Persians for the hegemony of the ancient world. Psamtik I, son of Nekau I, identified in Assyrian sources under the name Nabush Ez Zibani, a principal vassal of the great king of Nineveh, was settling down in the fort of Memphis and cautiously strove to fulfill the ambitions of his predecessor from the pre-Saite 24th dynasty, Tefnant and Bekan Renef, to reunite the fragmented country under the leadership of Sais, to strip the Delta chieftains of their power, and to expel the garrisons of the Assyrian soldiers. Records of this political process, i.e. Psamtik's seizure of power and the establishment of the new 26th dynasty, are sparse and are more precisely the process the process is far from being adequately reflected in the currently known written Egyptian sources. One must turn abroad to search for information to the partially preserved Assyrian royal inscriptions, which map very correctly with the tremendous political tensions which have arisen from all the warfare. The Greek sources appear to be more accessible and in some ways more coherent. The most informative being the very rich narrative accounts of the well-known Greek traveler and historian Herodotus. He visited Egypt around the year 450 BC during the first Persian occupation of Egypt, when the last great independent era was still vivid in the memory of Egyptians, and spurred the people to rebellion against the hated conquerors. According to Herodotus, Herodotus' Psamtik story is as follows. According to Herodotus, Psamtik's stories is as follows. He belonged to the 12 warring dynasties in the Delta who performed the sacrificial rites in the sanctuary of Hephaestus, or Ptah, at Memphis. On the last day of the festival, when they were due to pour the libations, the high priest distributed only 11 cups, and Psamtik, the one standing at the end of the line, took off his helmet and poured his libations from it. All the other kings at once realized that the prophecy of the oracle had been fulfilled and drove him from the temple. They remembered that the oracle had said that whichever of them used a bronze cup for pouring the libations would be the sole king of Egypt. They resolved to strip Psamtik of most of his power and exile him to the Delta marches. And a second oracle from the city of Buto predicted that Psamtik's revenge would come in the form of men of bronze appearing from the sea. He did not believe it, but a short while later, some Ionian and Carian raiders had left home in search of rich pickings, found that they could not avoid being driven onto the coast of Egypt, and disembarked in their bronze armor. Psamtik realized that the oracle was coming true. He got on friendly terms with the Ionians and Carians, and with promises of generous reward, persuaded them to support him with the help of his Egyptian Parthians and these foreign allies of his. He finally deposed the kings. Thus, if the Greek historian can be trusted, presence of mind alone, without adequate military support from the outside, would have made no impression on the small but independent kinglets. These events are unique, but at the same time very typical of this turbulent period of reunification, when Egypt was weaker than ever before. Firstly, there was the jealousy and implacable hostility of the old Delta families to everyone who could have been successful in their efforts to usurp power and thus a dominant position in the region, which was open from the south to the raids of the Kushites and from the east to the punitive missions of Assyrians. Secondly, there was a political instability or even anarchy in the country after the withdrawal of the Assyrian troops. And the last but not least, Egypt was going through a new experience with the military assistance from the Ionian and the Carian mercenaries, who were at the time the most respected military forces in the Eastern Mediterranean area, and had crucial impact on the revitalization of the Egyptian army, degraded to the level of local forces. Apparently, Samtik must have been considered by his Egyptian contemporaries and an Assyrian protege, and a real puppet during his reign over the territory of Athrabis, Memphis, and Sais. Consequently, in the critical moments of marked discord in the majority of them, he was obliged to escape for safety to the family patrimony, Kingdom of the West, in Sais. The struggles in the Delta against the great eastern chiefdoms of the Ma during the first years of Samtik's rule would have been bloody. In this respect, the silence of the otherwise very descriptive Greek authors like Herodotus, Diodorus, and Strabo about the presence of Assyrians seems a bit strange and poses many problems, because it appears as if the writers intentionally omitted an important authority of this era in Egypt. This could have been caused by the fact that the Egyptian priests, who were the main informants of all the Greek travelers, chose to ignore Assyrian rule. As Redford speculates, Samtik might have made full use of the military support proffered by the then still present until 653 BC, when they were expelled Assyrian soldiers, to enter Memphis, and later, with the help of the same garrison, he was able to stop the invasion of the Kushite king Tanwetamani and push him back south of Memphis, thus eliminating the possibility of a revival of the former state. With Samtik and his family, another ethnic group, Libyan, gaining ground. With Samtik and his family, another ethnic group, Libyan, gained ground. The ever-increasing hunger for power of the Libyan military chieftains is clearly evident from the Third Intermediate Period onwards, when, from the Ramesside era, we can see their tribes infiltrating the Delta territory. It is no surprise that the hunger for power, together with the weakness of the native Egyptian elite, led to the great chieftains of Ma and the great chiefs of the Libu becoming legitimate rulers of Egypt, and after the decline of the 21st dynasty, before they integrated into the very powerful Egyptian warrior class, the Machimoy, taking into account their strong nomadic roots. It is fascinating how extremely well Egypt managed to assimilate this ethnic group into its culture after a long period of acculturation. No one can deny that the Libyans had a deep interest in the glorious past of Egypt. The revival, based on ancient models, is generally designated as archaism. But the Saite Egyptians were not merely copycats. On the contrary, they existed and respected patterns they added. On the contrary, to the existing and respected patterns, they added their own bitter experiences of a people exposed to a gradual civilizational decline, hardly known to the Egyptians of the so admired Old Kingdom. For his policy of gradual unification, Samtik needed, above all, an efficient economic system, so very probably by the fourth year of his reign, 660 BC, if not earlier. Here we work with unsatisfactory evidence. Here we work with unsatisfactory evidence. He had started an intensive reorganization of the taxation structure in the towns of Nomoi beyond the border of his western patrimony. The, the persistent support of the powerful Heracleopolitan family of Padis in the Middle Egypt was in this respect invaluable. In 656 BC, with the help of diplomacy rather than army, Psamtik felt strong enough to stabilize the southern part of the country and send an unusual royal mission to the Montuhemhat, the fourth prophet of Amun, mayor of Thebes, and de facto chief of the local administration, which was still loyal to the Nubian kings and highly respected by the Assyrians. No further particulars are known about this negotiation, either from Psamtik's court's administration or from the Theban writer sources, despite the fact that this treaty can be considered the most important act of the first decade of Psamtik's rule. It is it's symptomatic that after spending the first years of his reign in military engagements in the north, the unification of the southern authorities had been a smooth process. Nevertheless, from the famous Nitocris stela, it is clear that the Mentuhemhat, certainly well informed about the events in the Delta, accepted Psamtik's idea to appoint his very young daughter, Nitocris, the sacerdotal function of the future god's wife of Amun in Thebes after Shenawepet II and Emernardis II. So during the winter of the same year, a flotilla of royal ships conveyed the Saite princess to Thebes with a great endowment. The king's desire to properly consolidate the relations with the powerful Theban aristocracy, which means with the so far hostile South, is evidenced by the high steward of the house of the Crates, Pabasa, being of Theban origin. Only later high and influential dignitaries from the Delta, Ebi, Pebes, and Padihornest, were employed. 2 years later, in 654 BC, Psamtik undertook a punitive expedition against the Libyan tribes that still controlled the western fringes of the lower valley from the Bahar Yusuf to the Mediterranean Sea. Further details of this undertaking were not very clear from the surviving texts, inscribed mainly on the best preserved stela, stela VII. And a series of other, only partially preserved stelae. Stelas 1 through 6. These were discovered west of the pyramid of Pepi II in South Saqqara along the desert road from Dahshur. Judging from the carefully recorded Libyan enemies and the number of mobilized military forces of all neighboring Egyptian nomes, his expedition was exacting but successful. His Majesty assumed himself at his armies, Stela 3. And he suppressed uprisings of the Libyan tribes. Thus, at the end of his first decade on the throne, also the western border of Egypt was under strict control of the state machinery, and there is no doubt about its suzerainty. The main text on Stela 7 reads, His Majesty was spending a pleasant time there when he saw the all great people consisting of men and women from every western district, Libyans, Tishemhum Libyans, in year 10, Then were pronounced the names of the mayors of every town in every order to mobilize the great ones in the following: have the 10 who conspired with their hearts to their desert land. Have the 10 who conspired with their desert land. They are mobilizing the north on numerous these officials before his majesty. Ptah, south of his wall, has decreed by command to every lord, O sovereign our lord. They are from Oxyrhynchus in the north of the Mediterranean. They are rebels against the palace. They were in resistance against of troops, overseer of hunters, every commander of every army of the capital, every commander, his majesty to them. Have the Melibians brought, and every fighting man of troops, the army entirely, who have been collected, registered at the portico, and who should be assigned. Every command of his majesty, year 11, first month of Peret, day 7. His majesty caused to surround and close the every hunter to against the oasis land in the canal, a foundation secured and made high with a wall without poles or weaponed against. He caused its siege walls to go forth. His majesty did this for the sake of causing. Look at the Egyptian history from the military political point of view. One can looking at Egyptian history from a military political point of view. One cannot overlook that during this time, 655 to 64 BC, ruling ambitions of the Libyan king Gyges, very well known from both Assyrian and Greek sources, were seriously jeopardized by the Cimmerian invasions from the north. His relations with Assyria were also problematic. He approached Psamtik seeking to build friendship and an alliance for the benefit of both monarchs, because Gyges had meanwhile sent a contingent of Ionian and Cairene soldiers to enter service with the pharaoh in order to help him reorganize his army and consolidate his position in Egypt. This phenomenon of pharaonic large-scale employment of Greek mercenaries will, for the late period rulers, be a major source of power, but also an immense trouble. It is beyond doubt that facing the expanding Near Eastern empires led to much greater awareness of the outside world in Egypt, which lacked stable military power in the form of a regular substantial army, became quite vulnerable. Psamtik must have realized that if he could raise the army to contemporary standards and revitalize the country, he would be ready to take on the world. And after a long period of fragmentation, Egypt could enter the international political scene as a united and powerful state and play a part in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern affairs. And that if the country as a whole should have undergone a vigorous reorganization, the religious sphere could not be omitted. That means that not only was the main god Amun closely connected with and worshipped by the Kushite kings, replaced by the goddess Neith, and the influence of Ptah increased, but Sais in the western delta became the new capital. The central administration was based in Memphis, which retained its long-standing role, and the power over the state was concentrated in the hands of the king, who was an absolute ruler, distributed his favor among the courtiers closest to him. In a way similar to the New Kingdom system, some titles have largely gone out of use, and others, like vizier, had a significantly limited authority and institutional attachment. Psamtik also considerably remodeled the judicial system, and his power over it was increased. The House of Judgment was transferred to Memphis. The king's influence on the work of the house is apparent from the surviving records, which also confirmed that to be granted a hearing was not such a complicated process any longer. The military class, which guarded the security of the country, belonged to the most powerful and quite numerous group in the state administration, partially due to the fact that the ruling family itself was linked to the influential chiefs of the Libyan mercenaries. Without exaggerating, we can speak about the militarization of the upper levels of the Egyptian society, with the kings almost permanently on the march, which is another similarity with the New Kingdom. Although the gradual implementation of these changes, although wait, through the gradual implementations of these tactics, through the gradual implementation of these changes, Samtik put an end to the centuries of widespread destructive particularism in all Nomai. He very successfully deprived the land-owning families of power and influence on political events by setting up strong local governments directly responsible for the royal court of Sais. But it did not lead, as we had seen in this case of Theban aristocracy, to a massive influx of officials from the north to the south. For the political situation was not ripe yet for such a step. Nevertheless, each town received a loyal governor or mayor, surrounded by a group of scribes who were fully responsible for taxation, justice, agricultural production, and land distribution. Moreover, already from the third intermediate period, it was common practice for the governor to simultaneously hold both a secular and military position. During the late period, the latter clearly gained importance over the overseer of the army, and the overseer of the army was able to maintain security in his own town against an attack enemy troops in coordination with other Egyptian nomai. Keeping this in mind, it should come as no surprise that the Sma Tau Teyefant chief, shipmaker, great chief of the harbor, was the holder of exactly these titles, general and mayor of the Heracleopolitan nome. Thanks to the relations of his families with the Sais, he was in charge of the flotilla which accompanied the royal daughter Necrotis on her journey to Thebes. After the military and political destabilization of the western part of Egypt, the western oasis turned into flourishing trade centers, which profited from the passing caravans. Men like Zed, Kusu Efank, and Sheben Kusu, governor of Baaria, belonged to the powerful persons during the reign of Aprius. The southern end of the Red Sea was not neglected either. Nekau II commissioned the digging of canals between the Nile and the Red Sea throughout the Wadi Tumilat. This project and what it led to were fully appreciated only during the Greco-Roman period. From both Egyptian and non-Egyptian documents, it is clear that the wealth of the country and the revenue came mostly from foreign trade. Of course, commercial activities linked with the traditional and strategically important ports spread along the Nile did not escape the attention of the Saite administration either. As we mentioned above, the new capital, Sais, thanks to its geographical position, looked to the north and to the west, and its rulers had lost no time in making contacts with the Greeks and valued more highly the commerce they enjoyed with Greeks than Phoenicia, as it was usual during the third intermediate period under the Libyan kings of the 22nd and 24th dynasties. Following on the heels of the troops of the Greek mercenaries that Samtik had acquired from Gyges came numerous Greek merchants and adventurers bent on colonization. It is true that elsewhere along the eastern Mediterranean coast, the Greek colonists had settled a long time before. Ergo, at Al-Mina at the Mount of Orontes in Syria, sometime around 800 BC. Previous political instabilities based on a local rivalry of local authorities was a negative influence on any commercial activities. The historical background of the early trading post, which was established around 640 to 630 BC at the mouth of the Canopic branch of the Nile, within the greater environs of the capital Sais, is not known. This settlement, Necrotis, was succeeded as an Empyrean port of trade to a group of Greek polis from the west coastal area of Asia Minor. Through lucrative trade in grain, silver, papyrus, oil, wine, and pottery between Egypt and Greece, it achieved great importance, which was able to uphold until the foundation of Alexandria for more than 300 years. While during the Saite period, Egypt achieved prosperity, and results of her foreign policy were paramount. This was possible only with permanent military movements, mostly on or while during the Saite period, Egypt achieved prosperity, and results of her foreign policy were paramount. This was possible only with permanent military movements, mostly on or precisely beyond the eastern frontier. It should come as no surprise that the military forces and their commanders are found with increased frequency on the post in this most threatened part of Egypt. Here, Psamtik started intensive building of various fortifications and watchtowers, as one done by Ramesses II centuries previously on the western frontier, to protect the country from the Libyan nomads. One of the best known, albeit still not sufficiently excavated, forts was situated in Daphne, Egyptian, the mansion of the king, where a contingent of Ionian mercenaries had been stationed. Before the close of Psamtik's first reign, as witnessed by the foundation deposit revealed by Petrie in the corners of the fort, only after he had such a solid base for extensive military operations here could he force back the mercenaries, the menacing Scythian invasion. In the late 620s, and after the alleged 29 years of siege, captured the commercially and strategically important Philistine city of Ashdod, and ensuring that the Phoenician cities became the vassals of the Egyptian crown. Behind this quite smooth expansion into the north, we can perhaps, according to Spalinger, detect the gradual weakening of the Assyrian power. The Syrians consequently abandoned their coastal territory in return for Egyptian military help in struggles against the Babylonians. This hypothesis has strong support in Psamtik's death, far from his capital, Sais, in the fields of the eastern delta. See below. Probably not so impressive, but relatively dense, was the network of citadels and strong points located on the Levantine coast, dependent largely on the mercenary troops located during the brief period of the Egyptian occupation of this area. These fortifications provided a picture of rather uniform architecture and yielded a rather limited range of equipment. A good example of this is the stronghold of Misad Hashshav-Yu, built on the coast in the vicinity of the above-mentioned Ashdod. Others were situated in the eastern direction, such as the fort of Tel Mela in the Negev of the Judean frontier fortress of Arad. Their importance in the military thinking will be frequently attested in due course. During the time of large Egyptian expansion, the late great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal died in the year 627 BC. This savant on the throne was a very cruel king. But on the other hand, he was able to keep the fragile balance of power in Western Asia, where back then nothing could stop the rising aggressiveness of the Chaldeans and the Medes and the Scythian barbarians. Psamtik deeply underestimated the military potential of these little-known enemies hitherto hidden behind the Assyrian military movement, and overrated the vitality of the slowly collapsing Assyrian empire when he decided to undertake the extensive military maneuvers that marked the last decade of his long reign, in particular the years 616 to 610 BC. As time went on, in 625, Cyaxares unified the warlike Scythian and Persian tribe. In the year 614, his numerous Median troops suddenly took over the city of Ashur, and then Xerxes, could be Xerxes, Cyaxares or Xerxes, signed a treaty of alliance with the most powerful man at the time, the Chaldean Nabopolassar. In May 612, the combined military forces of Babylonian, Media, and Scythians laid siege to the Assyrian king's capital at Nineveh and destroyed it, terminating the rule and existence of Assyria once and for all. The Assyrian crown prince tried to flee towards the west to Haran to place himself under the protection of the Egyptian garrison troops located at the time along the coast. Judging from the existence of Psamtik's embalming house in the environs of his military base at Daphne, it seems that the king himself, despite his age at the time, he would have been a 7-year-old man, intended to participate personally in the battles that followed, evidence to how he ruled for almost 54 years. The successor of Psamtik I. The foreign policy towards the Eastern empires did not change considerably at the time of the reign of Psamtik's son and successor Nekhau II, owing to the military support which the weakened Assyrian royal family led by the powerless Ashurbanipal II still received from the Saites. The political tension in the region increased enormously. When in 610 Haran fell into Nabopolassar's hand, he decided to resolve the stalemate by preparing a punitive expedition against Egypt. In a new power situation in the Near East, the Judean king Josiah became an ally of Babylonia in its fight against the old tormentors from Assyria. In this context, his intervention at the Megiddo Pass against the Egyptian forces of Nekhau II might be considered an act of loyalty to the anti-Assyrian and consequently anti-Egyptian alliance. Josiah's death in the battlefield and the subsequent imprisonment of his eldest son elevated his other son, Jehoiakim, to the throne. Jehoiakim ruled as an Egyptian tributary. Nekhau's campaign in 609 to the Euphrates, as well as all his military activities in the area, could have been already prepared by his father, and its impact on the anti-Babylonian mood. The siege of Haran in the summer of 609 BC was further enhanced by the anti-Babylonian mood was further enhanced by the presence of the garrison. The Egyptian hegemony over the Syro-Palestine was absolute during the time, but lasted, perhaps surprisingly for Egypt, only until the spring of 605, and appeared somewhat passive, probably because of Nekhau II focused most of his attention on internal projects. Nekau's name is closely linked with the building of the canal of the Wadi Tumilat, which connects the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and the northern bank was founded by the fortified frontier city called the House of Atum, or Tishuku, today Maskuta, Tel Al Maskuta. One wonders if the waterway, unusual in its conception and the dimensions, was intended as a possible way of attacking Babylonia, which was too powerful to defeat on land. Nekau's efforts to build a naval military force was unprecedented in Egypt's history. Although it was started in a much more modest way by his father, in any case, the canal existed also. The canal's existence also had a commercial effect. A crew of Phoenician sailors went south down the Red Sea. The Egyptian garrison station at Karkesum was neglected by the Babylonian only temporarily. In 607, Nabopolassar partially isolated the garrison and occupied a strategically important territory south of the Karkesum. Nekau responded immediately in order to forego a massive attack, and the Egyptian army was summoned in the spring of 606 and dispatched into North Syria. The Babylonian troops were vanquished at Kudamati Kumuk, but this was the last great triumph of Nekau II in Western Asia. The crucial battle took place the following year at Karkemish. In April 605, a large Egyptian army had gathered all its military forces, including numerous auxiliary troops, under the command of Saites, Carians, Ionians, Nubians, and Libyans, and launched into an attack against the Babylonians. Despite such an enormous concentration of military troops, the Egyptians were annihilated at Karkemish, and the rest was defeated at Hamath by the young Nebuchadnezzar, the son of and heir of Nabopolassar. As a result, Egyptian control over Syro-Palestine diminished, and after the destruction of the Egyptian army at the Palestinian plain in 604 BC, Ascalon was sacked. The Babylonians paved the way for the defeat of Egypt. Let me read that again. As a result, Egyptian control over Syro-Palestine diminished, and after the destruction of the Egyptian army on the Palestinian plain in 604 BC, Ascalon was sacked. The Babylonians paved the way for the defeat of Egypt. But back then, a dense chain of fortified Saite settlements and a stronghold lined the eastern frontier and the road to Gaza. Very promising recent surveys in the easternmost delta and the subsequent archaeological excavations detected some of these posts and still continue to yield bits of evidence in some areas. The true border fortress of the northeast frontier guarding the access to Egypt proper with very well-equipped military troops was to be found in the strategically very important Tel Kedwa, a defense system of about 10 fortified structures of various sizes and dispositions, well supplied with water, stood here at least from the New Kingdom as the battle of release of Saite I on the north wall of the Hippo-style hall at Karnak show. These fortresses are known as the Ways of Horus and served as Trans-Sinai route connecting fields Trans-Sinai route connecting Thiel, the fortress of Thiel, or Seal, or Sile, with Rapha. There is no doubt about their character, and the title of the high priest of the town, the fighter, possessed of justification. It is apparent reference to the military purpose of the settlement's location. Moving further to the west, about 32 kilometers. The settlement's location. Rereading. Moving further to the west, 32 kilometers. Samtic built another strong fortified military base at Daphne, with garrisons and Ionian mercenaries and settlements which grew around it. Unfortunately, our knowledge of Samtic's defense fortifications is rather limited and hardly as good as the knowledge we have of the strongholds constructed by the rulers of the New Kingdom, or even those coming from the two last dynasties, 29th to 30th, which lined the Pelusian branch of an entrance corridor to Egypt. The Babylonians attempted to invade Egypt during the campaign in 601 to 600 BC was unsuccessful because they found the Egyptian army drawn up and prepared to revenge the defeat at Karchemish. Very probably the victories scarab from the reign of Nekau II found in Migdol could confirm this event. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar and his troops were pushed back, suffering great losses, and returned to their homeland Babylonia. Nekau acted upon the opportunity presented in connection with the Babylonians' retreat and conquered the city of Gaza, which he had managed to hold until the year 597 BC. Available sources do not allow us to decide to what extent the defeat of Nebuchadnezzar was the cause of the presence of Greek auxiliaries or the possible alliance with the Jehoiakim, or both. In either case, Karchemish was never forgotten by either side, but considering the current circumstances, the Egyptians could hardly break the Babylonian hegemony in the Syro-Palestinian area, when the Babylonians had moreover a considerable support of the Phoenician naval forces. This is probably one of the reasons why, after Nekau II's death in 595 BC, his son Samtic II turned his attention to the south, which had been neglected for a long time, and where Egyptians had the ambition to acquire the territory of their old enemies. Here, the Kushite royal family had continued to maintain itself as the ruling power over vast reaches of Sudan, from its traditional seat in Napata. They probably did not abandon their plans for the reconquest of Egypt even after the expulsion of Tan Wetaman, and the consequence. As a consequence, Egyptian kings had to undertake punitive missions against the Wawat, as the stone blocks found in Edfu confirmed fortified the southern boundaries at Elephantine, and stationed a garrison there, which included large troops of Judean soldiers. The military and administrative headquarters were in Thebes. Some military activities of the Kushites were already noticed in the late years of the reign of Nekau II, and led to the decisions to launch a riverine expedition southward from Elephantine against the Nubian bowmen. They might have felt strong enough to resist the Egyptian army, but suffered a crushing defeat in the third reign of the year of Samtic II, 593 BC. At the time, a substantial army was assembled, comprising Egyptian soldiers under the general Amasis, the royal plenipotentiary, and the large mercenary contingents of Ionian and Doric, Greek, and Phoenicians under General Potasimto, under General Posampito, under General Potasimto, under General Potasimto. Samtic himself accompanied the army as far as Elephantine, but did not get personally involved in the battles. The complete preserved triumphal stela from Shelal and other partially preserved stelae with nearly the same content from Karnak and Tanis document the royal act. Year 3, second month of summer, day 10, under the majesty of Horus, Menachib, under king of Upper and Lower Egypt, two ladies, mighty of Ram, gold Horus, whose grace the two lands, Nepheribi, son of Re, of his body, Samtic, ever living, beloved of Kun, lord of the cataract region, and Satis, lord of Iebu, of Anukis, presiding over Nubia, good god, effective of counsel, valiant king, successful indeed, strong of arm, who smites the 9 bows. His Majesty was roaming in the marshes of the lake Neferibre, circling its inundated land, traversing its 2 islands, viewing the sycamores of God's land on its mud bank, his heart eager to see the goodness or beauty like the great God traversing the primeval water. Then one came to tell his Majesty, the troops, your Majesty, sent to Nubia have reached the hill country of Nubs. It is land lacking a battlefield, a place lacking horses. The Nubians of every hill country rose up against him, their hearts full of rage against him. His attack took place, and it was misery for the rebels. His Majesty has done a fighter's work. When the battle was joined, the rebels turned their backs. The arrows did not stray from piercing them. The land did not let loose. One waded in their blood as in water. Not one bound pair escaped of the 4,200 captives. A successful deed has been done. Then the heart of His Majesty was happy beyond anything. His Majesty presented 11, a great sacrifice of oxen and short horns, to all the gods of the Upper and Lower Egypt, and an offering to the gods of the palace in the palace of chapel. And an offering to the gods of the palace in the palace chapel. May he be given all life, stability, domination, all health, and happiness, like Re, forever. Following their massive invasion, the garrison were stationed south in the first Nile cataract. We are well informed about the certain mercenaries of this campaign, thanks to the inscriptions which they scratched in the surface of the colossal monuments of Ramses II at Abu Simbel. These included their names and an account of themselves in order to connect their mortal insignificance to the ruler's eternity. The king Psammetichus had come to Elephantine. This was written by those who sailed with Psammetichus, son of Theocles, who went as far upstream as they could, above Kirkis. Potas Simto led the foreigners, and Amas the Egyptians. This was written by Archos, son of Amoibichos, and Pelikos, son of Edumos. Surprisingly, perhaps, Samtic II did not benefit from this victory in a way his royal predecessors used to, and did not occupy the conquered Nubian territory. Instead, he created a Dodecachenos, a no man's land between Elephantine and Tecumseh. Some scholars see in this fact an absolute lack of imperialist tendencies on Psamtic's part, especially in comparison with the foreign policy of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. A more plausible explanation seems to be that Psamtic did not want to fragment the Egyptian military forces for a long time by employing them in 2 distant battlefields, and preferred to concentrate all his army on the eastern frontier. However, the Kushites could at the time scarcely really threaten Egypt, as the deep foray of the Egyptians' troops into the heart of Egypt demonstrated. His hostility towards the Nubians was sealed by erasing the mention of the Kushite kings from the monuments built by them in Egypt. In the later years, from 592 onwards, Samtik's policy towards the eastern neighbors became essential, and in the fourth year of his reign, he launched a peaceful campaign. Even priests were summoned to take part, as mentioned by Petes in the Rylands Ix, land of Kairu, along the Levantine coast, all the way past the cities of Tyre and Byblos. With regard to this journey, which should have been also a welcome demonstration of magnificent flotilla with regards to this journey, which should have been also a welcome demonstration of a magnificent flotilla of royal ships, we must mention the names of the two high officials, certainly the king's contemporaries, the Egyptian Hor, and probably the Libyan Ulhim, both holders of the title overseer of kingships in the Great Green Sea. The main aim of this propagandist tour must have been to revive the long-running but not really flourishing anti-Babylonian mood and to cement the existing alliances. Deacon, in his recent article, partly reinterpreted the historical situation in the Levant during the time and regards Egypt after the amazing victory over the Nubians as the most powerful state in the region, especially considering that the Babylonians faced many acute problems in the center of their country, and Nebuchadnezzar could not really set forth and set his army to the Levant. All this information must have reached the king in the form of intelligence reports long time before. The generally present peaceful character of Samtik. The generally presented peaceful character of Samtik II's mission would thus appear a bit surprising. Here, peaceful is almost equal to unavailing, and surely does not confirm his reputation as an aggressive ruler towards Babylon. Anyway, Samtik II stirred up the Babylonian uprising of the so far loyal Zedekiah of Judah, who expected strong Egyptian military assistance in his fight against the king of Babylon. On the return from his Palestinian expedition, Samtik fell ill unexpectedly and died on the 10th of February, 589 BC. His young son, Hayabire, or let's say Hayabire, or Apis, then took the throne. In the atmosphere of rebellion against the hated yoke of Babylon, which could have started as early as 592 BC, he set about to reverse the peaceful policy of his father in Western Asia. Apis definitely abandoned the strategy of avoiding the direct confrontation with the Babylonians when his army departed Egypt and wended their way along the Levantine coast, making for Jerusalem in an attempt to relieve it. The young king was accompanied by officers, among whom might have been distinguished holders of high military titles, such as, for example, Nefri Berannacht, commander of the infantry, and Amon Tefnacht, commander of the king's bodyguard. And of the elite troops, General Potasimto, who had already participated in the Numidian campaigns of Samtik II, may also have been present because he too fought on his lord's behalf in every foreign land, as did several other officials of powerful military rank dated about this time. The Babylonian forces quickly broke off the siege of Jerusalem, and the pharaoh, with a rather small contingent of soldiers he had taken with him, was confronted with the impossibility of marching up country and the Egyptians were forced to turn back. From about this time, we know for certain Nech Thorheb, a holder of the title commander of the fortress. The troubles were not yet over, and in 587 BC, the Babylonians finally captured Jerusalem and destroyed it. After his unsuccessful campaign in Palestine, the troops of mercenaries at Elephantine revolted and intended to immigrate to Nubia. This unexpected revolt, with regard to the distance between the two places, was stopped by a general Neshur, the commander of the Gate of the Southern Countries. It demonstrated how dangerous the positions of an Egyptian commander among a horde of turbulent foreign soldiers would have been. For ye rescued me from an evil plight, from the mercenaries, Libyans, Greek, Asiatics, and foreign, who had in their heart to go to Shashharat, His Majesty, fear because of the evil which they did. I re-established their hearts and reasoned by advice, not permitting them to go to Nubia, but bringing them to the place where His Majesty was, and His Majesty executed their punishment. Apries unfortunately put all his eggs in this single basket when he dispatched to the western border of the country Greek Cyrenaica, large troops of Egyptian Machemoi, but not his favorite and very effective Greek mercenaries as he intended to help the native Libyan tribes in their struggle against the aggressive Greek Dorian colonists. It seems that he did not expect such a catastrophic defeat. As a result, the civil war between Apries and the nationalists benefiting from the anti-Hellenic feelings. Between Apries and the nationalists benefiting from the anti-Hellenic feelings of many of the natives led to an emergence of a new and completely unexpected pretender to the throne, General Amasis, the future Amose II, about whose past we know absolutely nothing. He, with the support of the Egyptian Machemoi, defeated the legitimate king Apries at the Battle of Memphis in 570 BC. The dramatic circumstances of Apries' deposition was depicted on the Elephantine Stela dated to the 4th year of Amasis' reign. The text in the Stela, written on the order of the victorious Amasis, proves the existence of a fairly close relationship between Apries and foreigners, the troops of Greek mercenaries and Asiatics, with whose help he wanted to seize the reign, which had been usurped by the General Amasis. These important and dramatic events of dynastic changes are also mentioned by the Greek authors Herodotus and Diodorus. Nonetheless, the British Museum Stela from the year 1 of Amasis reflects that the support of the new pharaoh was not so demonstrable over all Egypt as was supposed, when even 8 months after his installation on the throne, Apries was recognized at Thebes. The growing influence of foreign mercenaries on the interior Egyptian situation became a very delicate problem. In order to prevent a potential revolt, Amasis moved the Ionian and Carian mercenaries from the eastern boundary of his realm, redirected them to Memphis. At that time, during the second half of the Saite Dynasty, Memphis should have been a real center of the country, with the ruling king at the head. The existence of the intriguing palace of Apries clearly confirms it. It was without doubt a well-fortified palace with garrisons of Greek mercenaries accommodated in the camp lying to the east of the palace. Memphis housed numerous military troops whose camps were widespread on the wider territory of the city. Herodotus recorded in his book the Tyrian camp, which lay south of the Ptah temple and formed part of the Phoenician quarter. Later, judging from the archaeological and written evidence during the Persian period, the palace accommodated a rather strong Persian garrison, and around it was located, certainly towards the end of the Saite dynasty, a community of Hellen Memphites in the Hellenion and Caro Memphites in the Caricon. Against the background of his economic reforms, Ahmoses II concentrated Greek trade activities exclusively to the Greek Emporion Necrotis, which was able to preserve its international autonomy but remained under the control of the Egyptian administration. At the beginning of his reign, Ahmoses was a real winner over the native rebels and the Babylonian invaders, but soon enough a much more powerful enemy appeared on the horizon in the form of the Persian Achaemenids. Very probably during the second half of his long reign, 44 years, he strategically reintroduced the Greek mercenaries into the forts on the eastern delta from where they had been expelled, very probably only a part of them, as a result of a strong nationalist tension at the beginning of his reign. Further, Djektumifang bibliographical inscription dated to the 42nd regnal year of Amasis describes in detail that he built a fortified wall called the Fortification of Amasis in Memphis, and in the same year also constructed another limestone wall for the temple of the god Sokar. As a result of his far-sighted foreign policy, new alliances among Egypt, Greek states, Libya, and the former enemies, the Chaldeans, were formed, but they all lasted in very limited time, entirely owing to the genially designed strategy of Cyrus the Great and his successor. Gradually, Lydia. For reference, the earlier sentence is being corrected now. As a result of his far-sighted foreign policy, new alliances among Egypt, Greek states, Lydia, and the former enemies, the Chaldeans, were formed, but they all lasted for a very limited time, entirely owing to their genially designed strategy of Cyrus the Great and his successor. Gradually, Lydia 546 and Babylonian 539 Babylon 539 were conquered. Cambyses disposed of a powerful army consisting not only of Persian troops but also numerous contingents of subject nations. Apparently, it is no wonder that the new and unexperienced Psamtik III, Amasis' heir to the throne of Egypt, had no chance of resisting the powerful Achaemenid dynasty under the leadership of Cambyses in the memorial year of 525 at the Battle of Pelusic, at the battle on the Pelusic branch of the Nile, after which Egypt became part of the vast Persian Empire. Moreover, at the crucial moment of the Egyptian anti-Persian fights in the border defense system, thoroughly constructed over more than 100 years previously by the Saite rulers, totally collapsed. Redoing that paragraph, or that sentence. Moreover, at the crucial moment of the Egyptian anti-Persian fights in the border defense system thoroughly constructed, redoing. Moreover, at the crucial moment of the Egyptian anti-Persian fights, the border defense system thoroughly constructed over more than 100 years previously by the Saite rulers totally collapsed, but also the defenders themselves fell short of expectations. Some key persons defected to the Persians even before the battle began. We are informed about a certain warrior Phanes, a Halicarnassian, a man of good judgment and a brave warrior, dissatisfied for some reason or other with his master, deserted the service, and taking ship, fled to Cambyses, wishing to get speech with him. Famous is also the story of an admiral, Adjuhorenest. I don't know how to pronounce these names, but famous is also the story of Admiral Ujahornet for his now forest Stila, whose new career as a mediator between the Egyptian elite and the Persian conquerors continued into the first Persian occupation. The great chief of all lands, Cambyses, came to Egypt, and the foreign people of every foreign land were with him. When he had conquered his land in its entirety, they established themselves in it, and he was a great ruler of Egypt and a great chieftain of all foreign lands. His Majesty assigned to me the office of chief physician. He made me live at his side as a companion and administrator of his palace. I compose his titulary, to wit, his name of King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Mesutir. 43. The Prince Count, Royal Seal Bearer, Sole Companion, Prophet of those whom one lives, the Chief Physician, Ujahornesnet, born of Atimirides. He says, the Majesty of the King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Darius, ever living, commander me to return to Egypt, when his Majesty was in Alam, and was a great chief of all foreign lands and great ruler of Egypt, in order to restore the establishment of the house of life. After it had decayed, the foreigners carried me from country to country. They delivered me to Egypt as commanded the Lord of two lands. In this way, he did much to protect Egypt, not only by keeping it from being plundered, but also by bringing the culture and political structure of Egypt into line with the times. And that is chapter 1. Chapter 2, Saite forts, their typology and location.